is really key. And I'll come back to that when I talk about recommendation letters. It's better if you have a choice between taking one long research project versus several short ones. It's certainly better to have a long enough research experience that people can really get a chance to evaluate what you do, and that you really have a chance to sort of dive in, sink your teeth into a serious research project, rather than a series of short projects where you really don't have enough time to get involved. But the most important thing is to get enough exposure to research so that you know that you like what graduate school is going to be all about, and that your advisor has enough, can see enough of what you can do to write a strong letter of recommendation for you about your research. Questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
So is it better to have a long research experience or multiple smaller experiences?
I think there are pros and cons with both. Okay, so with a long, one long experience, you're more likely to really get a sense of what research is all about, as opposed to, say, an 8 or a 10-week experience where usually you're spending most of the time learning things without really diving in. Another benefit is that you might be in the experience long enough to actually get a paper out, which can be, I don't think having a paper is necessary to get admitted to graduate programs, but it might be useful for getting fellowship opportunities. On the other hand, one experience only exposes you to one research area. Having shorter multiple experiences can give you the opportunity of sampling different research areas to sort of see what you're interested in. So there are pros and cons with both. I think it's a good problem to have. I mean, either one is good, as opposed to having no experience at all. But I can't say that it's necessarily, if you're in a research experience and you have an opportunity of continuing that versus taking on a different experience, I think you have to weigh that. What's the probability you're going to get a paper out if you keep going with this experience? Are you enjoying your experience? Then maybe it's worth staying in. If it's not so exciting to you and you are kind of not sure about what research area you want to go into, maybe it's worth switching into a different group and trying that out for a while. But both are good. I mean, it's good to have any kind of research experience at all, so either one is good. The other positive thing about having multiple experiences is you can get more than one strong letter of recommendation in research. So that's another plus to doing that. So there's pros and cons with both. It's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
So you're saying that like having a paper is not like necessary. So I'm wondering, to think of like research experience, does the outcome, is that important? Which means that the like research results that you have. Because when doing research, we have like different topics, and some are easier and some are harder, which means that if you tackle for the harder problem, you might get no result.
Yeah, honestly, I don't think that we're on the admissions committee expecting you to get a fantastic result as an undergraduate researcher. I mean, it's very hard to do that. Graduate students have to spend 4 or 5 years to get a strong result that they can write up. We're more interested that we want to make sure that when we admit you, that you know what you're getting into. So just having the experience of doing research and struggling with a hard problem, and then still applying to graduate school, knowing that that's what you're going to continue doing, that's important to know for us. And we can also get a sense, even if you don't come up with a great result, we can get some advice from your advisor as to how you handled, what experience you gained, how you handled your experience, how you were able to run into problems and problem solve, how you were able to be resilient in the face of difficult situations in your research experience. So all of those things are useful for the admissions committee to know. We're not really looking for some major result. I think it's more important to know how you responded to your research experience and what skills you gained. I mean, even if you don't get a great result, you're developing skills which are useful. Is that clear? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So number 7, you need to write a compelling personal statement. And this really is connected with what I just said about research. And the way I want you to think about this is, and I've already emphasized this multiple times, we are, the graduate PhD program is a research degree. So we on the admissions committee are looking for people who are excited about doing research, who have some research experience. But when you think about the kinds of things that go into an application, very few things actually tell us about your research ability or your research experience. The most important thing you're going to be doing in grad school. So your grades don't tell us necessarily much about that. GRE scores don't tell us much about that. Where in your application do we learn this very important thing about what your research ability or your research interests are? The only 2 places it really comes out are your personal statement and your letters of recommendation. So you need to make sure that those 2 things emphasize your research interest and research ability, as opposed to numerous other things you could talk about. So that's what's said here. The statement of purpose or the personal statement is very important, as it's one of the only places in your application where we can learn as an admissions committee about your research ability. So in your personal statement, you need to emphasize, what experiences you have, what contributions you made to those experiences, how much you liked it, what problems you ran into, what results you got, what excited you about them. This is where we're going to learn this, and there's no other place in your application where we can find this out. You need to explain what your interests are. What interests do you have when you go to a particular program? And you can't be vague. You need to be fairly specific in your descriptions. Some part of much of your personal statement can be generic. That's the same to every institution you apply to, but some part of the personal statement should be tailored to the specific institution you're applying to. So one way I like to describe what the personal statement should be about is 2 things. One part of it is explaining to them why they should admit you. What's special about you in terms of your research ability that they should be attracted to. And that can be the kind of generic thing that that goes to all the different institutions. But the second thing is, why are you interested in them? What is it about their program that makes you a good fit? And that part needs to be specific to the institution. So you need to go on their website and find out and make sure, you should be doing this anyway, but you should make sure that there are people there you're interested in working with, and say a little bit about why is it that University X is a place that is a good fit for you. And that tells the admissions committee that you paid attention to what they do, you looked around and were identified a few faculty you might be interested in, and why you're a good overlap. What made them in particular interested, you in particular interested in what they do. So that part of the personal statement should be tailored to the institution. When I see generic personal statements that are not specific to institutions, it's immediately a turnoff. And I've heard many admissions directors say the same thing. Make sure you have somebody edit your personal statement. It's really a turnoff to see grammatical errors, typos. It means that you don't care. It seems to mean that you're not careful. You're going to be invited to come to a program to do very high stakes research. You might be involved with multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. You're going to be doing things where you need to be very careful about making sure you don't drop factors of 2. So we want to make sure you're a careful person, and if you have lots of typos, then we're going to think that you're not very careful. We even get every year people applying to programs and putting the wrong institution they're applying to in the personal statement. That's immediately a turnoff. So be careful and have somebody edit your personal statements. Recommendation letters. That's the second place that we can get information about you as a person and your research interests and research abilities. So when you ask the question, who should I ask to write letters of recommendation for me? It's really important you pick people, at least one person, if not 2 people, who can comment on your research abilities, because we're not going to get that information anywhere else except for the personal statement. And this is an independent perspective on what your research abilities are. So this is very valuable. So you should have at least one letter writer who can describe your research abilities. And this is another reason it's so important for you to have a research experience, so you can, and you do well in that experience, so you can ask the people you're working with to write letters of recommendation for you. Now, letter writers from instructors, with a few exceptions, I see limited value. Of course, you're going to have some do that. Okay, why is that? Well, because if all the instructor is going to do is say you're a great student and you got an A and she or he got an A in my course, I can see that in your transcript. They're not telling me anything I can't find anywhere else. One way of thinking about your application is that every part of the application should try to project a different part of you, so that by looking at your entire application, we get the full picture of who you are. If you send multiple parts of your application that tell me the same thing, then you're not showing all that we can see about you. So if I have a letter writer who just repeats what I can see in your transcripts, it's not adding any information about you. If you need to have a course instructor, pick somebody who can comment on something that I can't see in your transcripts. Maybe you did a project with them. Maybe you did something that maybe you went to office hours or asked good questions. They need to tell us something that we can't otherwise get from your transcripts. But certainly a letter writer who can comment on research abilities, and maybe that's for simply a lab course. So somebody if you did 403, for example, that tells, I can learn a little bit more about you as a researcher from that than I can from somebody if you took 486 and got a great grade. Make sure you give your letter writers lots of notice, because I know some letter writers will limit the number of people they'll write letters for. They also want to have time to, they're very busy people, and if you come in 2 weeks before there's a letter that's due, they're not going to be happy with you, and they're not going to write a strong letter for you, possibly. So give them lots of notice. You should be asking them now if you want them to write letters for, say, December or January. You might provide them a copy of your CV or resume, and maybe even a draft of your personal statement, so they can amplify their letters with some of those details. Okay, questions? Okay, number 5, know what the application deadlines are. And all of these, I think, are updated. And in fact, these links should work. I will forward a PDF copy of this to Jamie, and she can circulate it so you can actually access these links. But this is when common schools that Illinois undergrads typically apply to. You'll notice that most of them are in early to mid-December. So they're coming up. There are a few stragglers like us that are late in January, but there's an increasing number of schools pushing their applications deadlines earlier to December. So know when they are so you don't miss a deadline. And later, but you don't necessarily want to wait to the very last minute to apply. Sometimes it can be beneficial to apply earlier than the deadline, because you might be, some of the internal fellowship deadlines of the school that you're applying to might be much earlier than the application deadline. That's true of us, for example. Our deadline is January 15th, but we have a bunch of internal fellowships that we can nominate our applicants for, like the Illinois Distinguished Fellowship is usually like January 1st. So if you wait till January 7th to apply, we're not going to be able to nominate you for this Illinois Distinguished Fellowship if you're a strong applicant. So sometimes it could be beneficial to apply earlier in the application process than waiting to the last minute. It's also true that we get like 20% of our applications the last 2 days. So it's hard to really give your application a thorough screening when you're coming in with 200 other applicants all at once. So sometimes applying a little bit earlier allows us to have a little bit more leeway to evaluate your application without looking at a flood of others that are coming in at the same time. Be aware of fellowship opportunities. Getting a fellowship can be very beneficial. It means that you have your own money. You don't need to rely on somebody to support you. You don't have to teach, for example, as a TA to support yourself. You don't have to rely on the research group you want to work for to support you on a research assistantship. You have your own money, and that can make it more flexible for you to work in a group. So there are lots of national and international fellowship opportunities that you might be eligible for. NSF has an application deadline of October 22nd, and seniors can apply for this. The Hertz Foundation is in October. The National Physical Science Consortium is in December. There's a fellowship for American Association of University Women Fellowship in November, and then there's the GATE. So these are the common national fellowships, but there are also, most schools have their own internal fellowships, as I already mentioned. So these are not the only ones you can apply for, and you might ask the institutions you're applying to if you could be eligible for internal fellowships. Like we have something called the Graduate College Fellowship that we can nominate people for. We have as I said, the Illinois Distinguished Fellowship. There is the Carver Fellowship that the College of Engineering provides. There are Surge Fellowships the College of Engineering provides. So we have a bunch of internal fellowships with internal deadlines that you can also be nominated for at Illinois, and I assume most universities have their own internal fellowship. So you might ask about whether you're eligible for any of those. Okay, so this is a very common question. Number 4, make sure you apply to a good distribution of schools. This is one of the most common questions I get. What schools are considered safety schools for me? How many schools should I apply to? So this is a very individual kind of question because it really depends on what your record is, what your academic record is, what research experience you have. But the general answer to this is that you need to make sure you apply to a distribution of schools. And there are particular issues this year that I'll comment on shortly. But every year, it seems like every year there are some extremely strong students who don't get into any graduate programs, and it's usually because they applied to too small a number of schools, and they were like 2 or 3 of the most highly ranked schools in the country, and then it's because they had a fantastic record. But you have to be very careful about doing that, because there are lots of good applicants out there, and applications to graduate programs are actually very different than applications to as an undergrad program, because it's really can be thought of as kind of a 2-stage process. When you were applying from high school to undergrad, basically the people who decided whether you got in was some dean that you would never meet. And so they went by according to what your grades were. Maybe you had a strong essay, maybe you had strong test scores, and so it's very easy to calibrate where you are. For grad school, you're going to be judged not just on your grades and your GRE scores, but you're going to be judged on your research letters of recommendation. And more importantly, the people that are going to be evaluating you are not deans and provosts who you'll never meet, but they could be faculty who you might work for. So at some stage, the application process for grad school gets very much like a job interview, where you can think of yourself as sitting in front of the person who you might work for. And they may see something in your application that, even though your grades may not be that as strong as some others, they may see something in what you've done in your research experience that excites them and says, hey, I want to admit this person because I want this person to work in my group. By the same token, if they don't get that sense, even though your grades are fantastic or your GRE scores are fantastic, if they don't get a sense, if they're not excited by the research that you're doing or what your research interests are, they may say, it doesn't matter, this person's a 4.0 and has a 94% GRE score. I don't really know what this person wants to do, and I don't really know who this person wants to work for, and so we're not going to admit them. And I've seen this happen. So you need to think about that when you're applying. But in terms of applying to schools, you need to apply to a distribution. You need to apply to not just the top 10 or 20 programs, because basically none of the top 10 or 20 programs in the US News and World Report ranking can be considered safety schools for anybody. I've seen some of the best applicants I've ever seen not get into some of those programs. So you can apply to a few, you can apply to as many as you want, but make sure you also apply to a good range of schools that are not necessarily highly ranked, so that you have a good chance of getting in somewhere. And I'll comment a little bit on how to find those schools in a second. One way to find this is to check out this Grad School Shopper. I hope most of you have heard of this. This is basically the online version of this book. So the American Institute of Physics publishes this book, which is a list of all these graduate programs that our program, all graduate astronomy and physics programs, all post in this book. But they put all this information online for free. So you can, if you go to Grad School Shopper via this link, all of these things can be downloaded as free PDFs. And also summaries of all the programs, and I'll show you a summary in a second. But the best way to identify a safety school is to look for the intersection of schools that have people that are good to work with in research. And you can identify these people by talking to faculty in those areas. If you're working in condensed matter, you can go talk to Taylor Hughes, or you can talk to Nadia Mason and say, hey, who are the good people that are working in condensed matter now that I might want to work for? And they can give you a list of schools. And then you can cross-reference that with places that have higher than you might imagine acceptance rates. And you can find that in Grad School Shopper. So Grad School Shopper, I'm going to skip this, I'll come back to it. Grad School Shopper allows you online to sort all the schools they list by acceptance rate. So this is actually the most recent listing, starting with the lowest acceptance rate. So you'll see your places like University of Chicago, University of Pennsylvania, Brown University, they have acceptance rates like 10% or so. But if you keep going, you're going to find programs that are very strong: Purdue, Ohio State, University of Minnesota, University of California, University of Iowa. They have really good people there, but because they're not necessarily highly ranked by US News and World Report, they get relatively small numbers of applicants. So for example, last year we got over 800 applications, but there are places that are really good that got half of that. And so they have a much higher acceptance rate, but they have very good people working there. So looking for this intersection between places that faculty that you know can tell you that really good people are working there, or they look good when you look at their websites, and then cross-referencing this with these lists of acceptance rates, which are relatively high, 20 to 30% is relatively high, then you can identify schools that are safer to apply to compared to Stanford and Harvard and MIT and those kinds of places. Okay, is that clear? Any questions about that? So I skipped this, but this is another. These are other places you can get information on departments. Of course, one of the best ways is just to Google the department and then go to their website and look on the research page and look at the faculty and look at what the faculty are doing and see if you get excited about the research they're doing. That's one way to identify places that have research areas that you're interested in working with. And then you can cross-reference that with this list of Grad School Shopper and find out, hey, they have really good people working in this particular field, but they also have a pretty high acceptance rate. So that's a pretty good bet for a place that I might apply. And you can also talk to faculty in those research areas that are here and get their sense of the program that's there. There's Grad School Shopper that I've already mentioned. There are various other ways of getting rankings, like the phd.org, the National Doctoral Program Survey, and of course the infamous US News and World Report. But beware of these rankings, okay? I don't encourage you to just base your judgments on these rankings, because the rankings average over all programs. There are programs that are not particularly highly ranked across the board, but have excellent people in specific areas that would be great for you to work for. These rankings are often also out of date. They probably don't take into account the fact that, for example, Illinois has hired 17 new faculty in the last two or 3 years, and that's not going to be reflected in the rankings for 5 or 10 years. People won't respond to that. So, you want to talk to faculty in research areas that you're interested in and say, where are the programs that just hired the hot new faculty that I would like to be able to work for? Because they're not going to be reflected in these rankings. They're going to be, these are things you're only going to find by talking to people. Okay, so there's some special considerations this year that you should be aware of. How many of you are going to be applying this year for grad school? Many of you? So you have to be particularly careful this year. So, and you might have heard this, I've already been asked by a number of undergrads. There has been discussion of, because of the pandemic and the associated economic downturns at various places, that there could be reductions in the number of the amount of funding, and there could be reductions in grad admissions. I've heard this mostly in humanities departments. Brian DeMarco and I are on a listserv that involves messages between chairs of different departments and different physics departments, and this was discussed. I didn't get much of a sense that there were too many physics programs that were planning to dramatically reduce the number of admissions, but there were some worries. So there were certainly some programs that were thinking that their funding for graduate programs was going to be cut, and that might cause them to reduce the number of admissions they have. So it is a concern. You should be concerned that maybe there might be a reduction in some programs. It's almost impossible for you to find out which programs are going to cut back their admissions. Also, some programs like ours had an unexpectedly large classes. So we admitted about 80 students, which was maybe 20 students more than we expected last year. So it's very likely that we're going to have a smaller class size next year. And I know there are a few other programs that said the same thing. So these are things that happen every year. You can never tell whether or not a program took on too many students or too few students. So I would just say in general this year, what this might mean is that it's probably a good idea for you to apply to more safety schools than you would normally apply to in a typical year. Just because you can't count on, I don't actually even like the term safety school, because it implies that you're definitely going to get in if you apply. Because of weird things that happen, let's say a school that, in 10 of the previous years that you would have gotten in if you'd applied, but last year they happened to take in twice as many students as they wanted. So next year they're going to take on very few students. So that year you might not get in because of some odd situation having to do with their past enrollment. And you can't tell this. So it's very dangerous to consider any school a true safety school in the sense that I'm absolutely sure I'm going to get into that program. And that's why it's good to apply to, a few, or even more than a few safety schools, so that so the likelihood that all of them have some weird situation going on is very small. And that's particularly true this year with the pandemic. You might want to apply to more safety schools than you would normally apply to in a typical year.
Question?
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So particularly about the last thing that you mentioned. So like some school might admitted a lot of students last year, so that they will have like smaller they will admit like smaller student here this year. So my question is, who should we talk to get that kind of information to know that?
Well, I don't know if you can get that information actually from Grad School Shopper. So if you look here in this list that I showed you, um, and it's already posted for this year, you can look and see, um, in addition to acceptance rate, they will tell you the number of admitted. Now, it's hard to tell from this number whether this is a large number or a small number, but 66 is a very large number for Columbia University. So my guess is that Columbia University took on more students than they expected to last year. University of Texas at Austin, 92. I'm almost certain that they can't that was way more than they wanted. So my guess is that next year they're going to, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong. So you want to look at the number of enrolled. So you see here we had 83. So you can tell both ways. You might be able to identify programs that, by looking at what they call the yield, how many they admitted versus how many enrolled. You can tell whether they got more than they expected or less than they expected. If their yield is like 20%, that's probably fewer students than they were hoping to get, and that might mean they need to take on a bigger class next year. If their yield is in the 30 percentile or above, that might mean that they took on too many and they're going to decrease the number. So it's really hard to tell. I don't know, but if you contact them, if you're going to be able to, they're going to give you that information. But you can look on Grad School Shopper by looking at the number that actually comparing the number that enrolled versus the number they admitted, and get a sense of, for example, 36 out of 93, that's a pretty high percentage for University of Minnesota. And I do know that Minnesota is a place that has said that they took on quite a few students, and they might take a smaller number next year. So this is, anything in the 30 percentile in terms of the yield probably means they're a little bit over what they expected. And anything in the 20s or the low 20s or below probably means they got fewer students than they wanted. So that's one way of telling.
Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, it's just because it actually also depends on I think it also depends on the field. For example, like finance matter and
It does depend on the field. So that's one thing you can't tell. You can't tell if all 30 of those students want to work in condensed matter, then that means that condensed matter is oversubscribed and all the other fields are completely open. So I don't think it would scare me away necessarily of applying to those places, but I certainly wouldn't let that school be the only place I applied to if it was a safety school.
I see. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. So number 3, make sure you apply to the right grad programs for you. You shouldn't be too selective, and this is part of not applying to too few places. Apply to all the programs in which you have a strong interest, regardless of, based on the research that's going on in that program. I know it's expensive to apply to these programs, but it probably, unless you're willing to possibly sit out a year if you don't get into the places you want, which happens usually every year to at least a few students, then it's a good idea to apply to all the programs who have research areas that look interesting to you with good faculty. Don't rule yourself out of good programs. I mean, don't say, well, there's no way I can get into Stanford or Harvard. Sometimes, as I said earlier, sometimes something in your research experience can overcome maybe a slightly lower GPA or a slightly lower GRE score, which is maybe not the same as what happens if you apply to undergrad institutions. One thing that's really important is not to apply to places that have only one research opportunity, one group that does what you want to do. That's really dangerous to do, because what if you go there and that person is not taking on any students that year? Or what if that you go there and that person is transferred to a different program or retired? Then you're stuck. So make sure there are multiple research options available to you in the places that you decide to apply to. And also make sure, don't assume that you only want to, just because you had a great experience in your undergraduate research experience, that's the only research area you might be interested in. Think about other research areas. At least 25 to 30% of students that apply to Illinois end up working in research areas they didn't indicate on their application because they weren't aware that they existed. So it's a little bit dangerous to apply to a place that only has one good research area, one good research subfield. You might want to consider places that have multiple good research areas in case you want to consider other options. Number 2, make sure you choose the right grad program for you. If you haven't settled, if you don't know what research area you want to go to, think about a larger program that has lots of different research opportunities. That will give you more choice when you get there. And not just different research opportunities and different research in the same research area, but also different lots of different people in different subgroups. Go on lots of visits. So once you get into programs, they're going to invite you, and now it may be completely virtually this year, but take advantage of opportunities to go to the place, even if it's online and remote, to get a sense of what the department is like. One thing that's really important, whether you're visiting remotely or in person, is to try to communicate with grad students. Grad students will give you a good sense of what the program is really like. They're very honest. They'll tell you what the climate is like. They'll tell you whether it's a positive climate, a negative climate. They'll tell you, what groups are good to work for, what groups are not good to work for. They're very honest. So try to go on visits, whether remotely or in person, and try to connect with graduate students in the department to get insight into how the department is run. Don't ignore quality of life issues. So don't get swayed just because it's a very top ranked program or the person that you want to work for is really, prestigious. That's important, but it's also important that you be able to survive in that place that has a climate, whether it's a geographical location or just the quality of life in the department is good, because you're going to be there for a long time. And if you're miserable during the whole time, it doesn't matter how good the program is or how prestigious the professor is, you're not going to be able to do your best work if you're not happy. So make sure you don't ignore those quality of life issues when you decide where you're going to go. Number 1, choose the right group for you. Make sure, again, when you look, that you pick an advisor, which is one of your most important decisions, that you can work with. And some things that you want to consider. Again, you might want to ask the advisor whether or not, before you decide to go to that program, you might want to ask the advisor whether they're taking on students. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to email faculty now before you've been admitted to programs, because you're not likely to get a very useful answer, if any at all. But once you get admitted to a program, then you can contact faculty before you decide where you want to go. You can contact faculty and ask them, I've been admitted to your program and I'm trying to decide where I want to go. I'm interested in your program. Are you taking on students? And they'll respond then, because they know, A, you've been admitted to the program and they know to take you seriously, and B, they know that you are, what they tell you may influence your decision about whether to go there or not. But make sure you take into consideration the style of the group in which you're interested, because different people work better in different styles. So is the faculty member you're interested in, do they like to monitor what you do on a day-to-day basis? They want daily or very frequent reports on your progress, or do they leave you alone for long periods of time? Some people work well in one environment, other people work well in the other environment. So you need to know something about yourself and need to know what the style of the research of the advisor is. And you can find this out by asking their grad students. So ask to get the names of grad students and ask to be able to talk to them so you can get an idea what the style of the advisor is. You'll want to know what kinds of projects you might be working on. Are you going to be working on highly collaborative projects with lots of different people? Do you like that style? Or are you going to be working by yourself on your own project? Some people would like that, some people wouldn't like that. What kind of person are you? What do you like? Are you going to be expected to start a project on your own? So are you going to jump into a project that's already started by another graduate student, or are they going to want you to start a completely new project because they got new funding for a new project and you're going to walk into a brand new lab or write a brand new code or start a completely new analytical project? This may sway you one way or the other about working in this group or not working in the group. Will you be funded? So in general, grad students are funded one way or the other in physics. You're not going to have to keep a side job, but many students have to support themselves by teaching as a teaching assistant, for example, as opposed to being a research assistant where you will work, be supported by the faculty member's grant. So you might ask the faculty member, is it possible for me to be funded? When will I be funded? Or am I expected to teach while I do my research? So this may be a factor in your decision. And that's it. That's all I have. Those are the top 10 list. But I'm sure you might have any other questions that I'd be happy to answer any other questions you have.
So someone put in the chat, how different are these applications, fellowships for international students?
So the international applications are identical. So we don't distinguish the international applications. So they're identical. The only difference is that's different for international students is because, at least at our program and in lots of other programs, there's a possibility you need to support yourself as a teaching assistant. We do want at least most of the international students to be able to have a high enough TOEFL score so they can actually teach, because we don't have very many positions that don't require teaching. So that's the only real difference between international and domestic students. So if you have a high enough TOEFL score to be able to TA, there's essentially no difference. Now, fellowships, it can make a difference because some fellowships international students are not eligible for. So that can be significantly different. So some of the internal fellowships it doesn't matter whether you're an international or domestic student. But in terms of just the application itself, there's really not much of a difference between the international and the domestic applications, particularly if you have a TOEFL score. So one difference is you will have to provide a TOEFL score for most places. That is a difference. But if your TOEFL score is above the level that will allow you to teach, then we don't distinguish the applications in any other way. Does that answer your question?
He said yes, thanks a lot.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah,
Professor?
Sure.
Oh, go ahead, please.
So you go first.
Oh, thanks. Professor, so for research, how do we document our progress? So there is like a couple of courses that you can take. There's senior thesis. So do those are they important, or should I just focus on having the research experience and having my advisor write a letter for me if I work for the group for, let's say, 2 semesters or something? Or should I focus on trying to fit the class?
Yeah,
somehow?
That's fine. I don't think it's necessary to have, take a class to document that you've done research. The most important documentation is the letter of recommendation that you get from your advisor. You know, if you had if there was a class that had a thesis associated with it, so it sort of forced you to write a thesis associated with your research that you could include with your application, that might be beneficial, but I don't think we really require that for our, say, 496 course. So it's
Okay.
sufficient to have a recommendation letter.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah. So generally, like how do professors think like one student is potential in the in future years to do the research? Because during undergrad we have like so kind of like limited understanding and also time to put into the research. So, and also as you said, like a lot of people changes their field after they go to the grad school. So it's kind of like uncertain to project but yeah, it's like how do people usually find like who is potential in doing research?
So by people, do you mean how do students find advisors, or how do advisors choose students?
How do advisor chooses students?
Well, it will differ. You mean what's the procedure the program uses to pair up students and advisors? Is that what you mean?
Sorry. No, my question is like when professors are writing like recommendation letters, or maybe like they think of the student like, yeah, and how do they tell like if the student is potential in the future research, in doing his future research?
You mean if you're an undergrad working in their group?
Yeah, right.
Well, it can be hard. I mean, usually, one of the complications, and maybe you're getting at this, is that usually the student is not working closely with the advisor. They're working with a grad student or a postdoc. So, and to that point, it's still a good idea to get the advisor to write a letter. If the advisor is savvy, they will know to ask the grad student or the postdoc for input for their letter and get some feedback. But yes, basically they will characterize, even though they weren't working day to day with the undergrad, they will characterize the progress the undergrad make. It's not a bad idea for you, if you're working in a research group, to maintain contact with the advisor so they know so they are aware of what you're doing and they can include that. But you can help them in those kinds of ways to write a good letter for you. But again, what they will probably do is they will talk to people who you did work with closely, like the graduate student and the postdoc, and they will summarize those points in their letter.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
But you can help. You can. That's one reason that if you include your CV and your personal statement when you ask them to write a letter, that will allow them to look for material to include in the letter that they're writing for you. But maybe just give them updates on this is what I did this week, or this is that will help them eventually write you a strong letter. But usually and I've read lots of letters from research advisors, and I know they're not working with the undergraduate every day, and they still manage to figure out, get a general sense of what the student is doing. And they probably, in many cases, they talk to the grad student or the postdoc that the student worked with, or they just summarize what the result of the project was, what came out of the project. But they usually do a pretty good job of trying to summarize the research the student did.
Yeah, that is very helpful. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, if not, I'm happy to have any of you, if you have questions about anything later on while you're applying, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about them. In the meantime, good luck with your applications, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help.
Thank you, Professor Cooper, for speaking today.
Sure. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.